Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, William H., Augustus, Keanu, and Judy at the Alexandria level, Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, and Steve, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level, and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Leonard the Great, Alex the Great, and Amma the Great. With that, I hope you enjoy this next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. I think today let's start off with a little review from our last go-around. We talked about Pius IX's early career and pre-papal life, you might say. Pius had a pretty solid career. He worked his way up through the ranks of the church and the curia. He had a reputation for moderate to liberal leanings, and he was not a frontrunner going into the papal conclave of 1846 after the death of the ultra-conservative Pope Gregory XVI. But Pius was elected out of a group of liberal-leaning cardinals. His first year or two of his reign, Pius's reign, was fairly good. He gave in on some reforms, but every time Pius gave in on a reform, the radicals wanted something more. There was rising anti-clerical and anti-church, anti-papal feelings on the rise among the more liberal and radical leaders in Rome. The Risorgimento, or Italian unification, was starting to gain some traction. Maybe not as far as conquering land, but it was gaining a hold in the mind of the people. We have much more on Italian unification in our episode with Marco Capelli of the Storia di Italia podcast, so definitely check that one out. Then the revolutions of 1848 hit. This revolutionary spirit just completely swept through Europe. There weren't actual huge gains for revolutionaries for the most part, but it definitely changed the outlook of Europeans. New ideas, new order, just newness that you just couldn't go back to the old ways, even no matter how much conservatives tried. The revolution of 1848 and how it affected Pope Pius IX and the whole idea of the church and the papal state is where we pick up today. We have to keep revisiting these two big themes of the entire series, and of which the papacy has these two pillars of power since the 700s: the role of the popes in religious affairs and the role of the pope in the secular affairs of his land, the papal state of central Italy. Every single event of the 1100 years, from the crowning of Pepin as emperor of the Franks to Canossa, the Avignon papacy, the Crusades, popes being imprisoned by Napoleon, the Renaissance popes, the Reformation, you name it, they all boil down to either the popes expressing their religious power or their secular power in one way or the other. In this series, we have tried to look at how the secular power of the pope was gone by the end of the papacy of Pope Pius IX, but in religious power, the Pope was supreme. By the end of this episode, we will see the 1,100-year run of the papacy as a secular power end. Pius himself had at least 4 different conflicts in his papacy. You could say Pius versus the secularists, Pius versus the liberal Catholics, Pius versus Victor Emmanuel, Garibaldi, Cavour, and the Risorgimento, Pius versus the modernist. These are the conflicts or problems to keep your eyes on going forward. Let's start right in 1848. The revolutions had broken out. There is a major threat of war. In Pius's early pre-papal days, it was easy to just say, oh, Austria should leave northern Italy. That was a popular opinion. The question always was in the how and the who and the why of getting Austria out of northern Italy. The radical revolutionaries really pushed this issue. They wanted Pius to declare war on the Austrians and attack them. Pius he said no. He did not want to jump in on the war to remove the Austrians. Pius's claim, he didn't want to declare a war that would pit Catholics versus Catholics. And never really stopped at Pope in the past, but maybe in this new world order and outlook, Pius was playing a decent political card. Pius also didn't want to attack Austria because they were an ally of the papacy and the papal states. They were helping the papal state continue. So all of this in the end just wound up putting Pius between a rock and a hard place. But he still said no. He held firm to that. As one might expect, the revolutionaries did not like that decision. Plus, on top of all this revolutionary activity, the economy of the papal states was in the complete dumps. For all of this and more, Rome went completely bonkers. The papal prime minister, Count Rossi, was assassinated on November 15th, 1848. Rossi had been working with Pius to make a sort of constitutional monarchy in the papal state with the Pope as the constitutional monarch. The pro-Republicans amongst the revolutionaries, they didn't like that idea at all. Rossi was even in favor of something of an Italian League of States in a rough confederacy to unite the Italian peninsula, which was not what the Risorgimento wanted. The Risorgimento was led by Victor Emmanuel and his House of Savoy, who wanted to have Italy under complete control under the House of Savoy. They didn't want this league of southern Italian states, Sicily, Naples, papal states doing their own thing, various duchies, etc. in the north, all in one united Italy, you might call it, but not united under one central monarchy. So at the end of the day, none of these factions were having any of that, and less than 2 weeks later, Pius found himself forced to flee Rome. Pius fled to a city called Gaeta in the Kingdom of Sicily, or Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Gaeta was just outside of the papal state, but safely inside of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. The town of Gaeta, it's out on a peninsula with a medieval-looking castle right on the ocean, is only about 145 kilometers or 90 or so miles from Rome. So really a couple of short days by horseback away from Rome, and by modern travel, you can drive a car in there in just a few hours. So it would be very close to Rome physically, and in a lot of ways, you might say mentally or spiritually. It's as close as you can get without being there. Pius was forced to flee from Rome disguised to save his own life. So we're finding Pius not in the greatest of situations. What we can say is a little over 2 years into his reign, he had been forced to flee the city in disguise as a simple priest. He effectively lost complete political control over the papal state. The Roman Republic was declared a few months later. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Richard Lim's This American President and other great shows. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more, and here is a quick word from our sponsors. Let's do a quick short word on this Kingdom of Sicily, Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. The Kingdom of Sicily is a place with its own fascinating history that goes back almost as far as where we sort of began this series, with Pope Zacharias giving the nod to Pepin to take over the Kingdom of the Franks in 752. Sicily and southern Italy had been connected in some sort of kingdom with the Christian leaders since the year 1072. Before that, Sicily was under Muslim control for several centuries. Southern Italy, the boot, so to speak, was controlled by the Eastern Roman Empire, then the Lombards. Around the turn of the first millennium, the Normans hit the scene. They eventually conquered southern Italy and then Sicily, creating the Kingdom of Sicily. The geographical limits, you might say, of this kingdom were pretty stable throughout the almost 800-year period up to the time of Pius IX. Politically, the kingdom changed hands, was dominated by one power, one kingdom, one duchy, you name it, over the course of the centuries. Even the name of the kingdom changed from time to time, but more or less the geographic area stayed the same. In the early 1800s, Napoleon had wrecked the place militarily and politically, as he was wont to do. The kingdom was reestablished after Napoleon as the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. In the 1850s, this whole area was fairly poor and economically backward part of Italy and Europe in general. It was ruled by the Bourbon king Ferdinand II from his capital of Naples, or Napoli if you prefer. Ferdinand, in a lot of ways, was like Pius IX. He started off as a reformer, but gradually became more and more conservative and ended up quite reactionary. Ferdinand made some compromises with the liberals, but eventually crushed them completely. Ferdinand happily took Pius in. It was a big move against the liberals in his kingdom. And it was a big shot across the bow against these secret societies we talk so much about throughout this entire series. Old Pius and Ferdinand had a lot in common, and they must have really been buds during that time. The rest of the story is both Ferdinand's kingdom and Pius's would end up the same way. The kingdom of Savoy and Piedmont were the motive power behind the Italian unification. Garibaldi and his gang wound up conquering the kingdom of Sicily by 1861, and that's basically that. Not for Pius, though. He's still got a little life left in his game. Pius worked really hard with his new interim, soon-to-be permanent Secretary of State, Cardinal Giacomo Antonelli. Antonelli would be by Pius's side for the rest of Pius's reign. He helped get Pius back into Rome. Pius got the Catholic powers, particularly France and Austria to some degree, to take over Rome and then quell the revolts. Pius was able to return to Rome as Pope and monarch in April of 1850, just about a year or so after his exile. The old liberal-light Pius was completely out the window, and the new arch-conservative Pius was now in. There was no more games for Pius, no more concessions. This was the time of the syllabus of errors that Pius promulgated and much more. And we talk about the syllabus of errors in more detail in other episodes, but it's basically a list of all the things Pius saw was wrong with Europe and with the world and with the church and what he thought about them. This is a very easy document to access online, either online or I think it might even be for free on Audible or a few bucks. It's very accessible, and it's just Pius saying no. Point 2, no to this. Point 3, no to that. Point 4, no to that. It was not a very popular document among liberals or even enlightenment-minded people in general. It's a very, very, very reactionary conservative document. During this whole year or so that Pius was in exile, he spoiled to get home. This is the time where he developed and honed his ideas and where he really locked into the idea of supreme papal power. During the 1850s, Italian unification kept gaining steam. With the help of Garibaldi and others, areas were taken over in northern and southern Italy and just started slowly circling around Rome. Garibaldi took the city of Naples, and the idea was to connect Victor Emmanuel's conquests as in the north and in the south as quickly together. But in the middle, you had the papal state in the way. Cavour thought it was too dangerous to attack Rome itself with the French in control. So they decided to work their way up the eastern coast and connect the two parts that way. And we have the Battle of Castelfidardo on the Adriatic coast in September of 1860. And that really broke the back of papal control over central Italy. Foreign Catholic volunteer units under the papal banner were completely defeated, and these were units from Germany, France, and other countries, even including French Canada. Throughout the 1860s, the papal states were pretty much Rome, which was still under French protection and occupation. The Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed in 1861, and they really desperately wanted Rome as their capital. It was tough to have the Pope in control with the help of the French. Cavour demanded Pope give up secular control of Rome, but that was a no-go from Pope. Cavour offered a pretty decent deal. He offered the Pope certain rights and privileges. This was called the Law of Guarantees, gave some buildings in the Vatican and Rome to the Pope. Also gave the Pope personal inviolability, meaning he was protected from violence, personal attacks, and was afforded certain legal protections and immunities. I mean, all in all, it was a pretty good deal for Pius, all things considered, but it was still a hard no for Pius. The Kingdom of Italy, the whole idea was to not antagonize the French any more than they had to. Here are the problems, though. The Papal States, even with just the city of Rome under the Pope's control, was smack dab in the middle of the new Kingdom of Italy. The Kingdom of Italy wanted Rome as the capital, and it didn't want an alternative power in the peninsula, even an extremely weakened one like the Pope. Some liberal Catholics called for a secular Italian state with the Pope as a titular head. That's a complete daydream. Nobody was going to go for that. First and foremost, you can only have one king, and Victor Emmanuel wanted to be that guy. He was greedy for that power, and I mean, in a lot of ways, can you blame him? He was the motive force behind everything with Italian unification. People like Garibaldi were extremely anti-clerical at best, and in a more extreme case, you could say even anti-religion. They had no room for the papacy in any capacity. And honestly, the Pope had no interest either. Pius completely dug in his heels. English Cardinal Henry Edward Manning described that as the beauty of inflexibility. This whole thing put a huge strain on the church, especially outside of Italy. More liberal-leaning clerics like Cardinal Newman did not like this stance from Pius, where others like Manning were loving it. And it put a big strain between Manning and Newman's relationship. Inflexibility was a winning issue for Pius, and really, in the long run, you could say it was a great choice. When Pius was liberal and lenient, the liberals attacked the papacy's secular power. Garibaldi and his crew were anti-clerical, anti-church anyways, so what were you going to win with them? Theologically liberal Catholics at this point, the localists, anti-ultramontane Catholics, would have marginalized the papacy to almost nothing. No secular power, no religious power. The big question is, what did Pius have to gain from giving in to any of these factions? Really nothing. If he gave in on anything, he only lost power and prestige. There's no upside to that. In 1870, everything changed. Fortunately for the Kingdom of Italy, not so fortunately for the papacy. The French army was forced to leave Rome because of the start of the Franco-Prussian War. The Kingdom of Italy was finally able to take control of all of Rome in September of 1871. After this point, Pius IX never left the Vatican City compound, which is about 109 acres. I mean, you can convert it to hectares. I don't think that really matters. I think the big thing to keep in mind, it's a tiny space. There's parks almost without a doubt in your hometown, and I'm not even talking like the big main park, that are way bigger than 109 acres or the size of the Vatican City. I mean, just to kind of put it in perspective, everybody's seen pictures of Central Park in New York City. That's 8 times larger. That just green space in the middle of Manhattan is 8 times larger than the Vatican City. So 1/8 of that park, cut it in half, cut the half in half, cut the half in half. And that's what you're talking about, the size of the Vatican City. Now, Pius also forbade Catholics from participating in the politics or civic government of the Kingdom of Italy. I mean, come on. How could they do that? This is their new country. They had very little choice in the matter. But this shows after 1871, everything Pius did as far as secular power was just a rearguard action. The battle was over. The war was over. The game was won by the Kingdom of Italy. The Pope only had the Vatican because the Kingdom of Italy and the King of Italy allowed it. Pius knew it too, and that played into his strategy. After 1870, Pius proclaimed himself the prisoner of the Vatican and referred to himself as the vicar of the crucified God. Pius said he would go to underground to the catacombs like the persecuted Christians of old to hide from the secular power, just like the ancient Christians did against the power of Rome all those centuries ago. It's all over the top. The Italian unifiers didn't want any of this because they knew it looked bad for them. Pius, they said, was free to come and go as he pleased, but Pius continued this whole narrative of captivity. In the modern idiom, you could call it all a publicity stunt, but it was a really hard publicity stunt for the Kingdom of Italy to counteract. It's very strange. They're being completely open. They said they're not going to attack the Pope. They're not going to do any of this stuff. But by the Pope kind of playing the persecuted card, it really, really worked. Pius won a huge propaganda and media victory. He got the narrative. He was able to, and you might say, hone the narrative to what he wanted it to be. Catholics from all around the world poured out sympathy for the embattled Pope. This play likely saved the papacy as an independent institution separate from the unified Kingdom of Italy. The Italian unifiers wanted a papacy that was neutered and under the control of the Italian kingdom. Pius played a long game. The papal state was gone. The 1100-year secular power of the popes was no more. But this opened up the papacy to an enormous prize, the rise of the Pope as the supreme central religious authority of the whole Catholic Church. Now, before we wrap up for today, there's one thing that I feel has to be mentioned, and this is a great place to mention it, is something called the Edgardo Mortara affair. Of all of the controversial events in Pius IX's long, record-breaking papacy, this Edgardo Mortara affair could possibly be the most controversial. And I mean, by Pius IX standards, that's no small feat. This is something that's still controversial to this day. It's something that you've probably heard of or definitely will hear of soon, because the story is or will soon be a major motion picture produced by Steven Spielberg. I can't get into all of the ins and outs of the controversy of this story. It's one of those stories that's extremely complicated and was controversial at its time and just became more and more controversial as the story unfolded in the 1900s and even all the way up into this day. I just want to attempt to lay out all of the common facts of the story, but not jump too far into the weeds. This topic could very well be an episode or two, or maybe even three of in its own right. But here we go in the broad strokes. Edgardo was born to an Italian Jewish family in 1851 in the area of northern Italy controlled by the Austrians. His family moved to Bologna, which was in the Papal States at that time, during the 1850s. In 1858, Edgardo became terribly sick and was near death. So he was about 8-ish years old at this time, 7-8 years old. A family servant, a young, uneducated Italian Catholic girl, secretly baptized Edgardo. And I know what you're saying right now. I said the same thing. You'd say, like, that's weird, right? How could she do that? There are many canons in the Catholic Church that allow for such emergency baptisms. First, baptism ordinarily should be done by a priest in a church, the normal way. In a pinch, a Catholic layman can baptize someone if a priest isn't available, and it's pretty much life or death at that point. In a real pinch, anyone can baptize someone if the emergency is completely dire. Obviously, it is very tenuous in the extreme to say that a teenage servant girl had any right to baptize a small boy on his deathbed in secret. Like, it's totally bizarre and out of the, just completely out of the realms of normalcy, I guess you might say, or propriety. But and on top of all this, the Papal States had civil laws that said Catholics couldn't be hired as household servants in non-Catholic households. And there were several reasons behind this. I mean, beyond just being straight up anti-Semitic, there was the stated reason of the laws was to prevent this exact kind of situation where a do-gooder nurse goes and baptized kids behind their parents' backs. Young Edgardo soon recovered from his illness. It was against the canon and papal state law for Catholic children to be raised by non-Christians, and they recognized young Edgardo as a Christian now. The church state approved of the whole validity of Edgardo's baptism and removed Edgardo from his parents' home to be raised by the church. Not just raised by the church, but Edgardo was going to be raised by Pius himself. Edgardo was a fixture of the papal court. Pius played with him and raised him like a son or grandson. And in fact, Pius called Edgardo his son. Edgardo never went home after this again. As you might expect, this caused an enormous international uproar. Everybody was crying out to Pius to give this poor kid back to his poor parents. The kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara was slammed all across Europe and the United States. It caused an enormous international controversy. Edgardo lived a long life and wound up becoming a Catholic priest. He lived until 1940 and died in Belgium at the age of 80, just before the Nazi invasion and conquest. So, I mean, you see that he could have been in a really bad situation all over again if that had happened, or if he had been there when the Nazis did wind up conquering Belgium. Now, to kind of flesh out the rest of the story, Edgardo wrote a memoir in Spanish where he praised Pius and the church. This is a highly controversial document. Some claim the document is a vindication of Pius and that Edgardo was happy with the rest of his life. Others say this document was doctored in the extreme and we really can't take anything of it at face value. For my money, I would say this was an incredibly embarrassing event for the papacy during a really difficult time. It was really an unforced error. They made a huge issue, not even considering just the humanitarian issues of going in and taking a child away from his family. I mean, just beyond this, but it was also terrible for publicity. I do not for the life of me understand why Pius and the church would go all in on this. There was no reason to. I think it was a case of the Pius administration, if you'll call that, knowing their secular power was going down the tubes and doing something very bold to show that Pius and the papacy were in control and this is their land and they're just going to do what they want, both religiously and secularly. It kind of combines both of those ideas into one. My question is, and I haven't been able to see this even addressed, is why didn't this sort of thing happen more often then? Why is this really just this one really prominent case? If it happened once, why didn't zealous Catholics try to secretly baptize every Jewish child they ran across? I don't know. Why didn't the church just say what the girl did was a nice sentiment, but it wasn't valid as far as baptisms go? Just leave it at that. How did something like this go so far? Why wasn't it sorted out at the local level? Why did it become such an issue? One way or another, this was a major stain and black eye on the papacy of Pius IX. One that continues to be a major issue for the Catholic Church all the way to this day, and probably for a long time after this day. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. So at the end of the day, the end of the secular power of the papacy started at the ascension of the religious power of the papacy. On December 8th, 1869, the First Vatican Council began. At the same time the papal state ended, we see the rise of the Supreme Pontiff begin. Just to put everything into time perspective, Pius lived for about 8 more years until 1878. Pius outlived Victor Emmanuel. He died about a month. Victor Emmanuel died about a month before Pius. He outlived Camillo Cavour, who died in 1861. Pius even gave Cavour a blessing on his death. Pius even had a really interesting afterlife. In 1881, Pius's coffin was being moved from its temporary resting place to the Church of St. Lawrence outside of the walls. The coffin was attacked by a mob after being whipped up by the Italian authorities. And this was really a time of rising anti-clericalism. The mob almost knocked over and took possession of the coffin. In the end, though, Pius's coffin did make it to St. Lawrence outside of the walls. I guess to wrap all of this up, what should we make of the end of the secular control of the Papal States? I mean, in all, you can say that 1100 years was not a bad run. Sure, there were some ups and downs along the way, but that's a way too big topic for today. How did Pius do, though? He did everything he could possibly do to protect the papal state as a secular institution with the Pope as its king. He did fail at keeping the institution going. Did Pius manage the decline? Did he give it a soft landing? I think you could say very likely so. For all of Pius's faults, I don't think he could have done anything better or worse. The papal state was on life support for the entirety of the 19th century. One intervention after another kept it going, but it wasn't going to stay forever. Even if Pius had given into everything the liberals wanted, Rome and the papal state were never ever going to stay in one piece under the papacy. It just wasn't going to happen. And any of the alternatives weren't going to happen. You weren't going to see the Pope as the head of a unified Italy. You weren't going to, as the king of Italy, Pope King, you weren't going to see the Pope as a secular leader of a confederation of Italian states. You also weren't going to see the Pope as a sort of Archbishop of Canterbury of the Italian states, because at that point, the Catholic Church was so much bigger than just Italy, and the Pope had no interest in just being a isolated, corralled entity. That just wasn't in the cards of how things had been progressing throughout the 19th century. Really, and all the tides of diplomacy were against the papacy and the institution of the papacy as a secular monarchy. Maybe you could say that Pius knowingly or unknowingly bought the church some time to rebuild and pivot to the next phase of its development. Now that we've closed this major chapter of the story of the papacy, we will move on to the next chapter, the rise of the religious power of the popes and the incredibly important Council of Vatican I. I hope to see you next time as we explore the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.